Hi, everyone. My name is Nadia, and I'm a software engineer on UI. It works, right? Yeah. Okay, sorry. So what UI platform is. And so we're a team of engineers who work closely with the design team, and we focus on web developer productivity. And our main focus is basically to build and support React component UI tooltip. And this is basically what I'm going to talk about today. This is a quick agenda of my talk, and I'm going to quickly walk through what design system is, then where component library stands in it, like what component library is, and then we'll move to looking deeply into component architecture and specifically into component overrides. Okay, let's start. So let's start with defining design system. And since, well, there is no standard definition for design system, so that's why we'll probably look into main components of it instead. And those components are design patterns. So it's like one of components of design system is design patterns. And design patterns is, it's all repeating elements and reusable solutions that are combined to create interfaces. And those elements is basically buttons, form elements, icons, like everything repeating. Next component in design system is an important one. It's perceptual patterns. What perceptual patterns are is basically something like voice of tone, typography, iconography, colors, layouts, animations, basically everything that creates difference between products within the same platform. Next one is shared practices. And shared practices is basically how those patterns are created, shared, and used. It's about making those patterns work together to achieve different purposes. And different purposes, example of it is basically handling some data, quick scanning and multitasking in one case, or for example, single task and thoughtful reading in another. And also there are a lot of other components the design system consists with, like for example, platform conventions, but we won't talk about those today. So moving on is, okay, let's look into component library. What is component library? Is component library the same as design system? Not really, right? So component library is basically, it's a pattern library. It's a set of reusable building blocks that can provide a healthy way to create consistent UIs as a part of larger design system. Component library can provide both visual and functional consistency to help users navigate and interact with elements in your UIs. And component library shouldn't be thought as a replaceable, as interchangeable with design system, but it should be thought as a tool to make design system more effective. Let's see basically how we can achieve that. And before we actually jump into how, basically how achieve, how to make design system effective, we'll look into, let's break out issues that we're going to solve here, that we want to solve. And I'll talk about my experience with, based on my experience. And so we had previous components library, legacy one, and it was specifically designed for marketing purposes. So things like theming, legibility, accessibility, and data-dense UIs weren't the primary goal of this library. But the library inevitably got extended to use in a lot of different applications, a lot of internal applications that had to handle data. So those things didn't really work well on different types of applications. And even though the goal of component library is to make it easier to create consistent UIs while reducing code duplications, We ended up with a lot of duplicated components and code across our platform in order to satisfy all those minor customizations that needed and that were different from project to project. So the challenges we wanted to solve with our new approach were make our component libraries as highly customizable as possible so we can give our developers some room to play with, and we can help them adapt our components more easily. Then we wanted to make it themeable to make it work for different products across our platform. And basically, yeah, so making it customizable, themeable, it will lead us to increase the reusability of our components. Okay, so let's go into how we did it. And okay, so this basically, we decided to break our components into smaller pieces, like to break it more granular. And this is the list of main kind of component types that we break every single component. So it's kind of sub-component types. And first one is behavioral containers. Then we also have styled elements. We have stateful containers and some composed drop-in components. And I'll talk about every of it in details after it. But, okay. Let's actually, yeah. So we'll talk about it on a select example. Everyone knows select. So this one is not like just native select. This one's something more advanced. It has pretty drop-down. It has some elements like clear icon. You can add search icon in it. It can be multi or single select. So you can see that it won't be just a select component, but it will be like composed component that will have to basically simulate select functionality with. Okay, so this is basically an example of all the exports that every component has. It's like not exact list, and also for select specifically, it's a reduced list. But I just tried to show all those type of subcomponents that we have. And here we can see that we export our select component. Basically, it's our behavioral container that renders all those presentational components. Then we have stateful select. It's basically, we provide both types of components. We provide our controlled component as, not for every single one, but for those that can be controlled or uncontrolled, we provide both controlled one and then uncontrolled, just to reduce for our developers if they don't want to handle or don't need to handle states themselves, so they can just import uncontrolled component and use it. And this is what stateful select is basically. Then we can see a list of styled elements or presentational components. And these are basically, we'll talk about it in details later as well, but this is basically every single of these exports as like styled root, styled control container stands for single element that component composed with. And then we also can see here some stateful select container and some constants that we export. And those constants can be something that, I know, like here we have size and type or state change, something helpful in order to avoid those hard-coded strings throughout our code base. Okay, moving on. Now we have an example of behavioral containers. So let's talk about it and what it does. And so we have a better understanding how we, what should go into behavioral container, what should go in stateful, and so on. So looking at this example, it's a pretty large example, but let's break it into smaller parts. So we can see that it's responsible, one of the main thing it's responsible for is basically composing and rendering all of those presentational elements. Besides just rendering and composing it, it also needs to figure out overrides for it. And this is basically how it's done. So for overrides, we're also going to look into it in more details, but basically it figures out like if there is a different like override component passed. So and it like if there is, it will reuse the override instead of default component. And then it also figures out props. If there are like some custom props passed, it will merge it and will ship, like basically will pass those props to a specific presentational component. And also same for style. So basically it figures out, oh, is there any style overrides passed? So I'll merge it and I'll pass it on the element. Okay, next. Oh yeah, so this is an example of that overrides, get overrides helpers that we use just to reduce like amount of code, like amount of boilerplate throughout the component. So we created some helpers, and here we can actually see how all those like figuring out if there is component override, props or style overrides are passed and merging it together. So it's just like simple example of helpers. Next thing that behavioral containers are responsible for is passing component states, like consistently passing component states throughout every element of our presentation, like to every presentational component. And here it's actually shared props. So shared props is basically a component, this behavioral container, or behavioral containers or uncontrolled component, oh no, controlled, sorry, controlled component state. And we'll look at the example of what those shared props looks like, but here we should notice that it's passed basically to every element. So it's passed to root, control container, value, and so on. So we pass it consistently in order, even though we don't reuse it in every single element by default, but we want to provide our developers ability to style based on those states. And here's basically what those shared props look like. And so about this example, basically it's just mapping of props and state of the component to kind of style props. And we create those style props with dollar prefix. Why we do that is due to usage of Styletron. And Styletron is CSS and JS engines that we use for styling. And it's actually very helpful to work with it and like this dollar prefix hack, because oh, this one? Okay, sorry. I think like it interferes with, or it clicks, right? Yeah, just give me a second, I'll remind. Thank you. Sorry about it. Okay. So dollar sign, like dollar prefix, why we use it? So we use it because Styletron by default strips out all the dollar prefix props, and so it's really helpful. We don't need to do extra work in order to avoid that unknown property passed on the element, like warnings from React. It just does it for us. So that's why we prefix all our kind of component state with dollar, and then Styletron strips it. Okay. So this is what shared props looks like, or component state. Let's move to styled elements. Yeah, I don't know if it makes sense, but this is basically like simplified structure of our select component. And I didn't like name every of those elements, but basically we can see that this component can have some root, then some container for our input itself, then some container for dropdown, and a dropdown we can see we'll have some list. And for input, we also have some extra elements to handle those icons. So it's like a lot of elements, right? And so styled presentational components or styled elements is basically every single one of these that we see in this schema will be presented as a styled component. So here is, and this is an example of a single style component. So it will be, so we do mapping basically one element to one styled component. With, in our own, like in base components, we never do more than one component into presentational component in order to give that, like, to allow more flexibility for developers to customize it. Then I'll show later how we can, when you use a component, how you can extend that kind of markup rendered. But in base components, we don't, we basically do one-to-one mapping, one presentational component, one element. And what's interesting about this example? So we use Staltron, as I mentioned, and this styled function is basically comes from Staltron. We also create a wrapper around it because for components we need some theme, right? And we talked about that we want to make our components themeable. So our wrappers that we create around Staltron's styled function will inject theme object into it. So basically then whenever you want to style your component, you have access to it. And so styled function, it accepts two arguments. First, it will be your component, or not component, sorry. It will be your element type that you want to create. So in this case, we create some div. And the second one can be either functions that return style object, or it can be just simple style object. And in case, so here we see the function as a second argument, but if you pass like object, you can, you can style your component. You will not just have access to the theme and props. So you can create basically simple styles for it. And then if you want more complex and dynamic styles, and if you want to have to reuse those theme values, then you need to pass function. And we can see that this function will accept properties. And what those properties are is basically, do I have highlight? Oh yeah, so okay. Highlight, but maybe a previous one. So we still see on line 2. We can see that in properties we get some disabled error is focused. So this is basically those shared props that present component state, and then we can see theme object in it as well. And here's highlighted one. It's basically how we create those dynamic styles. So we can basically style our element based on, in this case, we assign color to it based on if it's disabled, we want one color. If it's not, we want different color. And we can also see the usage of theme values in here as well. Yeah. So I think that's it about styled elements. Okay. Oh, a little bit about Staltron. Since I mentioned that we use Staltron, so I'll quickly walk through what is this and like what we get with it. So Staltron, as I mentioned, it's CSS in JS toolkit, and the cool things that we get with it is basically, I think that's my favorite. It's how much it reduces the amount of CSS that's going to be downloaded. So it basically, it creates, it dedupes all the styles and creates atomic CSS and kind of like virtual classes. So basically, if you have two elements, if you created two separate elements that have same style, let's say like margin left 10 pixels, what Staltron will do, it will create a single class with that margin left 10 pixels, and then it will assign that single class name to both elements. And every class name, basically every, what do you call it, like CSS class definition, or like CSS block, yeah. That's right. Sorry about it. So every CSS block, it will create. It will have only single declaration, style declaration. So that's how basically deduplication of styles achieved, and how it minimizes the amount of CSS. The other thing that we get with Staltron, it's similar to what you get with other available CSS and JS toolkits, it's basically all our styles are encapsulated, so it's component level styles. And why it's good, it's because we don't run into those cascading issues or like global style issues. So it's basically all styles is on component layer, component level, and encapsulated. And then the other one is basically, as I showed previously, it's dynamic styles. So we can, it's very easy to style your elements based on your component state and props. Okay, so this is about StyleTron. Next, we'll move to stateful containers. So stateful containers are part of our stateful components. And so what it does, what it's responsible for. So obviously, because it's like part of our stateful components, it should handle some state. So in this example, it's basically still our select example. We can see that it has some state, and that state is actually on line 3. We can see that its state handles value. So usually for most of form controls, you'll have controlled, uncontrolled one, and uncontrolled one will handle some value for it. And then in order to handle that value, it has onChange handler that basically does set that state. And we can see like at the bottom on line 21 that that state we pass as a property to our children. And children, we use children as a function in order to like make it easier here to pass all those props. And the other interesting part about stateful containers, so even though it's used for uncontrolled components, we still provide a little hook to kind of tweak the state if you need to. And we made it with these state reducers. So how it's done is basically you can pass your own custom state reducer, and every time, whenever we're about to change the state, we call those state reducer. Given in that way, we give opportunity for developers to tweak it. So we basically, and we tell them, here's what change happened, here's what we're going to set the next state to, and here's the current state. Kind of confirm if you want to set it to the same state, or just change it and pass us whatever you want to set it to. So that's basically where you can modify state, and then we'll set the state to whatever is returned from state reducers. Okay, and last but not least is stateful drop-in components. That's basically our composed component, and these ones are probably the simplest ones, and in most cases, it probably looks the same for every single stateful component. What it does is basically combines our container and creates that render prop function, like children function. Yeah, so not much in here. Okay, so let's move to overrides. So overrides, we provide kind of 3 main types of overrides for our components. And those are basically, you can override properties that are passed on our underlying elements. You can override styles on our underlying elements, and then you can replace those elements. And before we jump into like looking into overrides API and how it works, let's talk about benefits of it. And so first benefit we'll get with it is rendering flexibility. As I already mentioned, we can replace all those underlying presentational components, and moreover, we can extend those. So that gives like a lot of rendering flexibility. Then second one is no top-level API overload. I'll show, I think in the next slide, what the overrides API looks like, but basically it's kind of like one level down, so it doesn't overload top-level API, but not only that thing that gives this benefit, but also due to providing that flexibility into overriding props, styles, and for every single element, we don't need to kind of proxy all those properties to the top level in order to, like, what if you want to pass some ARIA label or like ARIA attribute to any like very deep element in your compose component, you can pass it through overrides instead of creating separate API for it. And the last but not least is basically consistency of sharing component state for styling. And this is basically what we talked earlier about those shared props. OK, so this is what overrides API looks like. And here's again my super, with a lot of elements, schema of our select. And I show below what it will look like in our overrides. So basically, we do provide a one-of-one mapping, as I said, element to presentation component, and basically in overrides, we do this one-of-one mapping. Yeah, so what you can pass to every single override is basically objects that accepts properties, styles, or component override. It's like approximate presentation of what the type of override looks like. So let's look like closely into every of those overrides and how it can be done. So we'll start with properties. And in this example, we want to pass some data test attribute. Let's say you want to do some end-to-end testing, and you need some hooks for your elements to find those on your page, right? So we want to pass some data test attributes for it. And we want to pass it to our controls container. So it's like, well, control container is actually, I think in this case, it's input container. Or actually, no, maybe it's root element. I don't remember. And we pass it as a property to this element. What's interesting about it is you need to make sure that whatever property you pass here by default, not by default, sorry, just whatever property you pass to it, it should be valid HTML attribute. Otherwise, unless you override component itself, it will not be stripped, and it will be passed on element itself, and then you will get that React warning, like telling you that you passed unknown property on your element. So make sure if you don't override a component and you don't handle those properties yourself, make sure that it's like valid HTML attributes. Next is style override. So this is an example on the left side. On the left side, we can see example how we can pass those style overrides. So it's basically another properties called style, and the value of it is basically the same as the styled function property. If you remember what we talked earlier, that styled function accepts two arguments, and second one is basically either styled object or functions that return style objects. So this is second argument is basically value of our style override. And so you can pass either object or styled function. And in this case, in this example, we pass a function because we want to create some dynamic styles. So we check for, we get our properties and theme object, and we want to change some border color based on its state. So when it's focused, we set it to one color, then assign some default color, and then we want to style it differently when it's error case. And we also reuse theme values in it. So we kind of provide this theme and level to it as well. And it's very actually important to reuse theme values if you create your own kind of component or library on top of base library. So you can provide that theming for users of your own component. Okay, Next is component override. This is basically the part of the component that provides rendering flexibility, a lot of rendering flexibility. And we can see that it's another component properties that we pass to our overrides. And in our example, what we do here is basically so in this specific example, we can actually see how we extend our single element to more than one element, right? So we do, in this case, basically looking at the custom drop-down container, we still want to render default wrapper, like default presentational element, because we don't really want to restyle, create new one and restyle it. So we'll just reuse whatever library exports, so we'll use that style drop-down container, and then we want to extend it. So we want to add some, in this case, we add title to our drop-down. So we create additional styled elements, that's called drop-down title here, and then we basically just compose it. And important parts here is there may be some props that we pass to that presentational element, and in a lot of cases, it's something important, and those can be, for example, some event handlers or some accessibility attributes. So make sure that you pass your whatever properties this component accepts, make sure that you pass it down to kind of like outermost component, probably in the most cases, unless you like sure what you're doing and you want to pass it to some other element. But make sure you pass those props so it will not lose those accessibility keys or some important handlers. And then make sure to pass to render children, because unless you override something, I would actually always probably pass like render children here, because you never know, like, what's inside. I mean, you know, looking at the API, but so in this case specific, we override our container, so it means we'll render a lot of other elements inside, and those will be children. So even though we add some new children to it, we want to make sure that everything else is rendered as well. So we pass children here as well. Okay, so now when we looked how we can add all those like prop, style, and component overrides, let's see what result we will get with it. So this is basically our select component with its overrides. On the left side, you can see the default component, and it has some blue border color, and no title, extra title in dropdown. And on the right side, you can see all those customizations that we added. And we can see that in focus state, it didn't change the color. It actually set some grayish color to it. And we can see our select color title in the dropdown. So we didn't need to create like new components, right? We just passed a few overrides, and this is the result we've got. Okay, now the stressful part. So now let's do some more overrides, and I'll show how we can override. So we saw how we can do it with overrides API. I'll show another example how we can do it with like just theme. Okay. Switching, nope. Okay, now we switched. Yes, where's my mouse? Just give me a sec, I'll figure out things. Okay, I see my mouse. Okay. I don't know why it's not clear. Oops. And the light doesn't let me see my screen well, but I'll try my best. Sorry about it. Okay, maybe I can increase brightness. Oh yeah, it's much better. Okay, so these are examples that we're going to do, and we're going to, since we saw an example on select, this time we're going to look into date picker, and let's actually render default date picker, because I forgot to add it in the very beginning. So we'll see what the default looks like, and then we'll add a new theme to it, and we'll see what the override looks like. So let's first we'll import new one. Oh, not new one, the default one. We'll do the stateful, sorry. I'm really bad at typing in public, so I'm sorry about it. Date picker, and then we'll export it from base UI date picker. Okay, so we have our date picker, and we want to render it somewhere here. And I have like notes for myself. So it will be stateful date picker. We don't need this one. And it's like you can look up like what the API it has in documentation, but since I know what to do here, so I'll just, what I want to do is I want to make it range date picker, so we'll pass a range here, and then for range we need to pass initial state here. And initial state will be something like this. Okay, let's start our application and see if it renders. Hopefully it did. Oh, what's going on here? I think it renders, but it's kind of ugly. I'm not sure why. Let's see if I have some errors. Probably not, because it's silencing. Oh yeah, I didn't expect this one. Kind of feel like something broken. Okay. Range stateful date picker. So I kind of feel like it should render. So I don't know what's going on here, but maybe I can just like do a little hack here. Oh, you know what? I feel like it also renders the wrong thing. Let me check my code, because I don't render two date pickers. I render single one here, right? So we'll start this one and we'll restart. Don't know what's going on. And I'll just restart my. Okay, so we do have stateful date picker still. We do import it somewhere here, right? So we don't render this part yet. We'll restart this part. Sorry about these difficulties. Let me actually just, I have some source code here, and I don't think it will change something, but we'll try. We want to do here, and then we'll remove our custom one for now. Maybe I'll open also a new window. Oops. What's going on? Oh my gosh, I felt so embarrassed and stressed that it doesn't work, and I don't know how to make it work. It just really renders the wrong thing, because I have only single date picker here, and it renders two. But let's actually start, let's look into the rest of code, and then we'll figure out it. Okay. Maybe I'll show for now what I'll do. I'll just show our from documentation what the date picker looks like. And we want to find date picker here. Where's date picker? Okay. And so basically this is what date picker looks like. It has blue colors. It has some drop down here also with blue colors. So this is what date picker looks like. Let's create theme. Okay, so for theme, in order to create new one, we need to import some helpers from our base UI library. And we'll import here, so we'll import theme provider. This is basically what our provider to wrap our component. Then we need create theme helper, or like function, to create actually new theme. And then we'll also need light theme primitives. So those primitives is basically because we don't want to override every single property in our theme. We want to override just like a few, like those blue colors. We'll change it to green. So that's why we'll reuse default ones and then extend it with our custom ones. And we'll get it from base UI. OK. So how do we create theme? We'll reuse this comments here, and what we need to do is, so we'll create, our custom theme. Then we need to create theme, right? And create theme basically accepts two arguments. First one will be primitives, the ones that we actually will reuse those light theme primitives. And the second one, it will be other props that we want to pass into theme. And let's move it here. So here's our primitives, and we want to, as I mentioned, we want to preserve those light theme primitives and then extend it with our overrides. All those colors are green. And then we also want to add, we want to override this shadow as well. So we won't get the bluish one, but we'll get green one. OK, this is our custom theme. How I can use it? So we need to, and I also have a comments here. So we need to create theme provider, basically. Theme provider. And then we need to pass that theme into our theme provider. And we put our component inside of it. So here we do, we actually need to import first. So we want to import our, we'll also do stateful date picker. And we'll get it from base UI date picker, right? OK, and then we'll, and then we'll render it here, somewhere here. Stateful date picker. And we'll make it also range. And we need to set initial state. And we'll set it to some value here. It should be an array value. So it actually works as a range. OK, so actually, right now, it should render green date picker. But considering I have some issues, rendering issues here, that I have no idea what's going on, let's see so if it will work. Oh, now we have some errors. Nice, because we didn't close it here. OK. Let's see if it's changed something in our browser. Oh, please, please, no. Oh, it's so messed up. Why it renders to? Oh, it actually doesn't render to. Oh, I see what's going on. That's like super strange thing. Let's try to assign this height here. Maybe 100 pixels. Will it change? OK, it did, but there's something going on deeper. Is this one large? This one is our input. What's going on? If anyone can see what's going on, just let me know so I don't waste more time. Line 40. Say it again. Oh, yeah, this one is definitely, yeah, we need to pass, thank you so much. Yeah, we need to pass theme, custom theme. That's a good catch, thank you. Gosh, feels so, yeah, I know it doesn't fix the issue, but that's a very good catch. Gosh, I should have made screenshots so at least like we can see results, and now I don't even. React Dev Tool, I do. Let me actually, so now I actually still don't render. Oh, I actually know what's going on. Sorry about it. I actually figured out it's because of some column styling. And I have a little time left, so I need to quickly, let's actually add custom here. So then it will fix. It's basically, the issue is because I added to container, I added to render it in columns, and that's why it breaks weirdly. I'm actually not sure why CSS works that way, but it breaks the single element into these two columns. So that's what's happening. But if we do custom date picker, if we do render custom date picker here, and I believe we already imported at the top. Yeah, so it's basically our custom one. It comes from here. And that will, oh my gosh, that will fix the issue. Okay, so we do stateful range initial. Okay. Whew, yeah. Okay, so here's our default one, everything blue, and we can see range. Oh my gosh, that was embarrassing. So we can range here, our selects here, and here our green one. And we can see also green colors, nice green colors. We can see green colors in our dropdown. So quickly, I still have 10 minutes left, so I want to add more complex overrides. So this is an example of overriding with theme provider. And you can basically create, so theme provider is, you can add it at the top level and wrap the whole application, so you can modify all the components in the application, or you can wrap single component into it, and you can modify like single component with your custom theme provider. And what I want to show is basically some components, like for example, date picker. It reuses other components. And in this case, we can see that our date picker reuses select component. So the catch here with overrides is basically, if you want to override that select thing, okay, where's my notes? Here. So we're going to pass overrides, overrides to our date picker. And here's what will override look like. And for that select is basically there is an identifier for it. It's called month select. And it will be the same kind of, not really the same API for it. Since month select is a component and not presentational element, so further, in order to override whatever is in month select, we need to look into select override. And so basically month select in this case, it's not presentational component, as I already mentioned, so it's component. So we need to look at it as we're kind of creating a component. And it means like here at the top level, it still will be props, but then we can pass. What do I have here? So I need to get option label. So select, if we look into its documentation, do I have time to look into it? But if we look into documentation, so we can see here, we have like this get option label API, like in its top level API. So we can modify it. And what we want to do with get option label API here, we will do it right here. It says that we want to check if there is like, what it says, if there is selected item. So it will be an option state, and it will have this property selected. So if there is selected, what we want to render is, what do we want to render? I think we want to render, actually, no. So we'll do some span here. Oops, sorry, span. And then we'll still pass in it option label. This is basically what by default it renders. And then what we want to do, we want to add the check mark. And check mark will look like U2714, right? Let me actually write it here as well. Okay. And actually default one. So if there is no selected, we want to render something as well. So we'll return option label, just label. So we'll add check mark only to selected option. And I hope we'll see it now. Yeah, so we can see May is selected now, and it has check mark. 8 minutes left, and I need to add. Then how we can add more. So this is an example how we passed top level prop to our select. And I want to show how we can pass all those, how we can access overrides of the select. So in order to access overrides, we basically need to pass overrides prop to select, and it will be, so select has, as we saw in our slides, it has a control container. And what else we want to override? Let's do all control container. Okay, so it has control container identifier. And for this, we'll override background. So we need to override styles. And for styles, we'll do function here that will accept some, what do we want? We want focus state. So we'll do focused. Oh, is focused. I think it's is focused. And then we'll also reuse our theme here. And, oops. It will return, what do we want to return actually? We need to do this. And we want to do background color. And background, it says we need to do is focused, right? So if it's focused, we want to set it to primary 300. Okay, so we'll return here theme, colors, primary 300, and if not, we'll just return primary color, okay? We'll do colors, primary. Okay, let's see. So now what we did, we basically for our control container, we overridden background of it. So actually, it already rendered, but basically it was dark. If you noticed, that select when when it was focused, it was dark background, and now it should be lighter. And here's what we've got. So we've got light background, we've got check mark. We can also override like this. I wanted to override, but it's basically similar to container. So we can override basically every single element in our select. And for now, this one is not changed, but we can add same override to our year select. And this will look like, so we'll make it consistent. So we want to pass overrides here as well. And maybe we'll move it to some select overrides. Okay, and then this select overrides, we'll just create it somewhere here. And we'll move all of these guys into select overrides. Oops, yeah, right here. So now it should change our year select as well. Nope, it didn't. Select overrides, select overrides. Oh, props, good catch. I'm so glad that everyone got how it works. Yes, it's props. That's awesome. Okay, now it should work, right? Yay, cool. Thank you so much. It's a really cool. Okay, so I think it's all with my overrides examples. I have 5 minutes. I can show also like how I wanted to change this color by default to be not black but green, but it's basically a similar approach to how we override container here. Control container, it will be just different property. It will be different elements that named option content. But we won't go into it. So where's my slides now? Okay, and my slides are somewhere here. Nope. Okay. Back to slides. So we saw how overrides work, and I think like a lot of people got it. Thank you so much for your help. It was really awesome. And nope, this one. My thing doesn't work, and my keyboard doesn't work. I don't know how, let me actually get, yeah, I'll just show like this, the rest of my slides. Sorry about it. So as I mentioned, I probably didn't mention actually, but our component library is open sourced and it's called Base UI. And in this last slide, I give some helpful links. So basically, first one is our documentation, and it has live examples of all the components we have. And it's basically, it's code sandbox examples, so you can play with it. And next one is our repository link. Since it's open source, feel free to go check out code. If you find some bugs, feel free to create a PR and send it our way. Or if you want some new feature, you think it will be useful for everyone, feel free to create issue. We'll be happy to look into it and work with you, like if we're going to add it or not, or like what we're going to do with it. But we're really happy for any contributions. And next one is a Styletron link. Basically, as I mentioned, we use it in our base UI library. Check it out, it's really cool. And the last one, follow my dog on Instagram. We post sometimes, not often, but we do post updates. Yeah, I think that's all. Thank you so much.